Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating theological deep dive by Peter J. Leithart into how ancient sacrifices fundamentally alter how we worship right now. We're going to explore this profound shift from ancient, highly restrictive rituals to modern Christian practice. And honestly, we're going to uncover how the shadow of those old laws might still be heavily influencing how you view the church today.
Let's kick things off with a pretty provocative question. Think about this. If Jesus ended all the ancient rules, why do so many modern believers still approach the communion table with this deep, almost paralyzing sense of fear and unworthiness? Why do earnest, faithful Christians sometimes back away from the Lord's table, treating it like it's some sort of dangerous zone they just aren't holy enough to enter?
To answer that, we're heading into Section 1, the ancient rules of worship, where we'll be demystifying a concept called stoicheia to cosmo.
So we actually run into this Greek phrase, ta stoicheia to cosmo, quite a bit in Paul's letters, especially to the Galatians and Colossians. Basically, it translates to the elementary principles of the world. Paul is usually using it to refer to the rigid regulations and rules of the Torah. He uses this phrase to describe the sort of childhood of Israel, right? A time when they were essentially tied down to these rudimentary guarding principles. And he strongly warns early Christians against slipping backward into those shadowy, antiquated systems.
Because, you see, the stoicheia wasn't just some abstract philosophical idea. It was a rigid, very real religious system. We're talking strict purity codes, heavily graded distinctions of holiness, strict adherence to festive calendars, and, of course, ceremonial animal sacrifices. It was a whole world built around do not taste, do not touch. Now, for most Christians, it's pretty self-evident that Christ's triumphant death totally liberated us from these elementary things. Jesus ended all of that. But did he end the logic behind it?
That brings us to Section 2, applying old to new. Do ancient rituals still dictate modern worship?
Here's where it gets interesting. If almost all Christians agree that Jesus completely dismantled that Stoic system on the cross, why in the world are rituals like communion and baptism still causing so much continuous and, let's be honest, sometimes bitter argument? How do we actually figure out how to worship today without just sliding right back into that old legalism?
Well, let's take a look at the classic pedo arguments. These are the arguments used by Reformed theologians to justify infant baptism, and they do this brilliant step-by-step move from Old Testament inclusion straight to New Testament practice. It goes like this. Step 1. Male children were marked for inclusion via circumcision in Old Testament Israel. Step 2. Israel and the modern church are essentially the exact same people, bearing the exact same promise, which naturally leads to Step 3. Therefore, children should be marked for inclusion via baptism in the New Covenant Church.
So the real game changer we uncover here is this massive underlying assumption, the idea that Old Testament ritual patterns still possess regulatory authority over the modern church's worship. The assumption is that we can legitimately, logically, reason from ancient ceremony to modern ceremony. Now, these arguments aren't claiming total one-to-one continuity. I mean, obviously, baptism doesn't involve a physical cut, and it includes women. But they absolutely assume that specific features of those Old Testament rites still retain their liturgical force. They assume those ancient blueprints still inform how we do things right now.
Let's dive deeper into this in Section 3, Sacrifices and the Early Church, looking specifically at how Paul repurposed Leviticus.
Paul actually does something pretty surprising here. He argues straight from ceremony to ceremony. When he's defending his right to make a living from his ministry, Paul directly compares the Levitical, Aaronic priest who eats a portion of the meat and grain from the altar to the Christian minister who receives a financial livelihood from proclaiming the gospel. He's essentially saying that proclamation is a kind of sacrificial service.
And in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, Paul takes it even a step further. He lays down this strict liturgical rule based entirely on ancient sacrifice. He says that eating sacrificial meat literally binds the priest to Yahweh's altar. Then he applies this directly to the Christian Eucharist, pointing out that the blessed cup and the broken bread is koinonia. It's a sharing in Christ's sacrifice. Because of this, he argues, Christians absolutely cannot partake in the table of demons by eating pagan sacrifices. You just can't share in the table of the Lord and the table of demons. It's fascinating. Paul is using the ancient rules of the altar to regulate early Christian behavior.
Okay, moving right along to Section 4, Rethinking the Sin Offering. We're going to unlock the ancient hatat.
Hebrews chapter 13 does this beautiful job of mapping out how Jesus perfectly fulfilled the exact sequence of the ancient purification offering. Under Levitical law, If an animal's blood was taken into the holy place, its body had to be burned completely outside the camp. It could not be eaten. Jesus follows this exact step-by-step timeline. First, he suffers outside the gate, crucified outside Jerusalem. Second, he ascends to heaven as the ultimate high priest. And third, he presents his blood in the heavenly sanctuary. But then, Hebrews says something absolutely shocking. It says Christians get to eat from an altar that the ancient priests were strictly forbidden to eat from.
Now, to really wrap our heads around the gravity of this, we've got to look at theologian Nobuyoshi Kiyuchi's groundbreaking linguistic study on the Hebrew words for sin and the purification offering, hata and hatat. Usually, we just think of sin as a bad action, right? Breaking a rule. But Kiyuchi's research suggests it is something far deeper and honestly far more psychological.
When you stack up the tragic shame of Israel in Jeremiah chapter 3 right next to Adam and Eve in Genesis chapter 3, a stunning psychological parallel emerges about what sin actually is. Look at it. Both disobeyed God's command. Both tried to cover themselves, Adam with leaves, Israel with humiliation, and both faced the same profound consequence, hiding from the face of God in the trees or resting in this continuous state of shame and estrangement.
And that leads us to our final section, Part 5, From Hiding to Open Access, the Paradigm Shift.
Kiyuchi makes this absolutely profound point. He says, sin is not merely an action, but the continuous condition of the whole person. It means to hide oneself from the presence of God. Think about Adam in the garden for a second. He breaks a rule, and what's his immediate gut instinct? To hide his face from God among the trees. That hiding, that withdrawal, that hostile self-alienation, that is the very essence of sin. And under the ancient stoicheia, God actually responded in kind. He hid himself behind veils, clouds, and thick curtains in the temple.
So the really monumental question for us today is this: how exactly does the cross of Jesus Christ dismantle this universal human instinct to hide? How do we break free from this endless, exhausting cycle of humanity hiding from God and God hiding his full glory behind temple veils?
The contrast here is literally staggering. The Old Covenant was a covenant of exclusion. It was built entirely on thick veils, distance, and complex protective rules, specifically designed because the hiding sinner simply cannot face the holy God. It kept everyone at arm's length. But the New Covenant? It's a covenant of open access. The veil is torn. Those ancient exclusions are burst wide open into invitations for face-to-face communion.
It's the ultimate cosmic reversal. On the cross, Jesus is basically Adam coming out of hiding. He's lifted up, exposed fully to the whole world, taking on the ultimate shame, so that the self-estrangement between God and humanity is completely destroyed. In Jesus, God and man finally come face to face. No veils, no distance, no shadows.
So how does all this abstract theology actually change our everyday practice? Well, the ultimate takeaway for transforming the modern communion table is this. Treating the Eucharist with stoic fear and self-exclusion is basically reverting right back to Adam hiding in the trees. Think about how often throughout history people have kept their distance from the communion table out of some sense of pious fear. But those ancient rules of exclusion, they've been permanently transformed into rules of access. All disciples who followed Jesus outside the camp are welcome to the meal. Actually, abstaining from communion out of pious fear is a full reversion to Stoic religion. Self-exclusion is simply repeating Adam's sin of hiding in the trees all over again. Which leaves us with one final, pretty profound thought to carry with you. The next time you approach worship, will you remain fearfully hidden in the shadows of those ancient rules, clinging to your own feelings of unworthiness? Or will you step out of the trees, leave the exclusions behind, and confidently take your seat at the open table? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep learning, keep exploring, and I'll see you next time.